Hello and welcome back to Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas, brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs from the Baillieu Meyer studio in Melbourne. Today we have some serious matters to discuss. There are allegations of serious war crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. We'll be talking about the Brereton report, the sociologist's investigation that actually is said to have sparked that report, the political wash-up, Andrew Hastie's very, very interesting commentary on what it all means, how it's flowed into our culture, what it means for the War Memorial, and much else besides. This, as I say, a serious matter deserving a serious discussion. We'll also be returning to last week's topic, which was what did happen in South Australia as it went into meltdown over a cluster of coronavirus cases, and what does that tell us about how the issue is still being managed in South Australia and Australia. Serious matters to be discussed. A very serious person, of course, is Dr. Chris Berg from RMIT University, my co-host on this podcast.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Good to see you, Chris. Still on Zoom, hopefully not for much longer. And also someone who has some qualifications to actually talk about our first issue today, having worked in the Defence Department for some years, research fellow at the IPA, Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
Thanks so much for coming in, Andrew. Yes, Chris, tell us a little bit of the background about the Brereton report and what its implications are.
Absolutely. So, Scott, the Brereton report came out. This has been a few years in the making. Obviously, there have been claims about potential human rights violations and war crimes in Afghanistan for some time. But the Brereton report has come out with a really substantial and really very concerning range of allegations. Of course, these allegations will be contested in legal settings, but they've recommended that 19 soldiers, or the Brereton report has recommended that 19 soldiers be investigated by police for the, quote, murder of 39 prisoners and civilians and the cruel treatment of others. There is credible information that 25 current or former ADF personnel were involved in this, and there were 36 separate incidents to be referred to the AFP. This is obviously a really disturbing finding. I think it's important that we address it on Looking Forward for a couple of reasons. It does shed some light into we're not in a position, of course, to litigate the veracity of these findings. They seem, to my mind, extremely disturbing, and I hope that justice is served. But I think it does reveal quite a bit about the nature of the war in Afghanistan, our attitude to the war in Afghanistan, and even our attitude and parliamentary framework around how we manage the Defence Force, how we manage Australia's longest running war. But why don't we start, Andrew, just on the incident itself, or incidents itself as they've been alleged. What was your immediate reaction, and where do you start thinking about these sorts of things?
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris, that there's not a lot of point, I think, in litigating the issue, in second guessing the report, the details in it. There's a judicial process that will be underway, and I think we need to wait and see if people are convicted of these things that they're accused of, and if they are, then there should be the full measure of the law should be meted out. I don't think there's any dispute about that. The issue is more interesting in a sense, in a policy sense, when you start thinking about, as they've tried to tease out with some of the reporting about this, is the conditions within which these incidents took place. So whether there was Andrew Hastie, the MP from Western Australia, who himself served in the SAS, has raised the issue of parliamentary oversight being perhaps insufficient of the Defence Department and the ADF in particular, that there's a sort of a disconnect between what's actually happening in the ground and what is understood to be happening on the ground by the politicians charged with overseeing it in the public interest. So I think that's where we have to start. And then I think from my own perspective, one thing that from Andrew Hastie's commentary piece in The Australian that stood out to me was his discussion of how the war had been presented by the ADF to the Australian public. And I think that raises some interesting questions too about there's an operational question here about that the ADF has to be presented to overseas audiences, to enemies in a particular way. It has to be able to manipulate the information space to win wars for strategic objectives. How do you cordon that off from the Australian public so that they're not misleading us as well?
Yeah, so I think that let's come back to how the ADF has handled perhaps how it provides reports on war, information on war, and also indeed the Brereton Inquiry itself, how it's managed that. But I think this has been the issue perhaps which has brought to the head how we think about Afghanistan. I think others have remarked in quite different contexts that after wars there is usually a reckoning. I mean, wars are terrible things. And in Australia perhaps we haven't had it so much because of the nature, because it was a contribution to an American-led force, a contribution to an international force. It wasn't like Australia's decision to go into Afghanistan. So perhaps we never as a country have had that reckoning, and it's always been something that's sort of done by other people. And I must admit, I'm not immune from this. I was quite surprised to find 30,000 Australians have toured through Afghanistan in various deployments over the period. It's actually a not insignificant thing, but it's not really been central to our political process or culture. And I can understand why people who are concerned for our great country's reputation don't want to see it traduced by allegations of war crimes or seeing our own institutions pursuing soldiers who served on behalf of Australia in such a dangerous theatre. I can really understand that response, but it's almost like it's such a shock now because we haven't really thought about Afghanistan. We haven't thought about why it was that only the special forces were essentially at the pointy end of Afghanistan for so much of that. We never used the regular army as much as other countries might have done. It's really lifted the lid on a whole bunch of things, I think.
So that's why I just want to ask you, Andrew, as someone who's had some experience with it, and of course you would have been in the Defence Department during the war in Afghanistan, i.e. in the last 20 years, 19 years. I mean, you say that the ADF has been presenting a story to Australians that is sometimes hard to distinguish from the story it presents in a propaganda piece. But to my mind, I mean, the war in Afghanistan has no public footprint whatsoever, no cultural footprint, and there's no general awareness in Australia that we are engaged right now in our longest war.
Yeah, well, I think just to clarify, I mean, I thought that from Andrew Hastie's piece when he said that the public presentation of the war in Afghanistan to an Australian audience amounted to an information operation was quite a striking use of that term, which is a term of art for essentially a positive campaign of propaganda to deceive people. So towards a strategic end, that's what an information operation is. The Australian Defence Force's information operation capability is not under doctrine. It's not supposed to be deployed to deceive Australian audiences. So that's where this sort of grey line comes through, because you would say that it'd be a serious thing to say that the ADF had deliberately set out to mislead Australians about what was going on. And so it's probably, and I think this is what Hastie
and he
really
may not have meant to.
What I think Hastie meant, and I'm sure this piece was almost, or may well have been read at the Department of Defence before it went out, because he's a former SAS soldier. But I think what he was getting at was that it amounted to an information operation by omission. Which is where the grey area is that you've just touched on, Chris, is that it's kind of been allowed to sit below the surface as it's just a fact of our political life in a way, that we just have had troops serving continually overseas on this mission that most people are divorced from, that most people aren't invested in. And I think that's, in part, I mean, this might sound like a stretch, but I think in part that's kind of how Australian government operates generally, not just in the military, but that the Australian people, and we've seen this with coronavirus, are willing to trust that there are experts in charge pursuing ends that have been carefully selected. And the fact that most of the burden in Afghanistan has been carried by our elite troops has just reinforced this. Well, they know what they're doing, and this Brereton report actually says is actually perhaps they didn't know what they were doing. That the lines of oversight of what was really happening on the ground within the Defence Force itself, and then through that to the Parliament, were so obscured that people weren't really, that trust that we all kind of have in a latent sense is actually misplaced. I think that's very alarming. No,
that's and we'll come back to perhaps the experience of those special forces and their continued redeployment. But on that idea of omission, I was particularly struck by something that Hastie said in an interview. And I've listened very carefully because obviously what a perspective he has. And as he pointed out, he's now been in Parliament longer than he was in the SAS. So what an amazing perspective he has. And when he says we must embrace the process, I think we should listen. But one of the omissions, he pointed out that other countries had much more, not openness, you wouldn't expect complete transparency, but for example, Sebastian Junger, the filmmaker, was embedded with troops in Afghanistan, American troops in Afghanistan, and made an amazing documentary, which I actually have on DVD. It's called Restrepo. I'd forgotten I had it. And
incredible.
Yes, is it not incredible? This was a forward base, not a main base, almost like an outpost, the sort of thing that the Brits would have had in Zululand, in just before Islandwana. It's like not a fun place to be, and that it's like Chris. So you've seen it too.
Yeah.
Now Hastie's point was that we did not have that kind of thing in Australia. So when he talks about parliamentary oversight, when he talks about the relationship with the public, like even oversight's the wrong word. What he means is engagement. The parliamentarians need to be more engaged. The public needs to be more engaged. He talked about politicians. He was respectful, but even like Malcolm Turnbull, Julie Bishop, people like this coming into Afghanistan. And in a polite sort of way, I think he's saying they really had no idea. Well-meaning, but no idea.
Yeah. But I think
because they're not engaged in a process of oversight.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to the media being more closely integrated into this or allowed wider permission. And there were a number of, Australian journalists were regularly allowed to come and, observe what was happening with the troops in their base and things like that. But I think the Australian, it is actually because the Defence Force does not want to be seen as too chummy with the media, as manipulating them, as too much a part of that sort of parliamentary triangle media politics circus, that's one of the reasons for this secretiveness. Part of it is also that there's a kind of, I don't think I'm talking out of turn here when I say that there's a kind of suspicion of how the media reports on the ADF. There are various scandals in the past concerning Duntroon, the
Defence Force Academy,
and where there's a sense that a number of media outlets or reporters they choose to report on the ADF only when they're seeking a negative story, and so because you can't just sort of propagandise to them, the easiest thing to do is just kind of manage that as thinking about that entirely in terms of communication risk, not as a communication opportunity, not as an opportunity to report to the Australian public, but as a risk that it will be misrepresented by people who are hostile to what the ADF is trying to achieve. And I think that is sort of one of the underlying tensions here when Andrew Hastie brings that up, is that perhaps that's something that the ADF needs to look at, perhaps that's something the Department of Defence needs to think about, is whether that, having developed perhaps that attitude towards the media, is counterproductive. But on the other hand, the United States military, the CIA, places like that, they cooperate very heavily with American media, with Hollywood. I mean, if you read any stories about how the movie Zero Dark 30, about the strike on Osama bin Laden, how that movie came to be, it's
functionally written by the CIA.
Yeah, it's actually it's extraordinary, the level of manipulation of American audiences that they're allowed to do. And I would say in Australia we are better off if we don't have, for example, screenwriters embedded with our defence intelligence. I think
but on the other side, though, and I agree with that, I definitely don't want propagandistic culture wars, effectively. On the other side, though, I think I've been very convinced by there's a ANU academic, Andrew Carr, who's written very compellingly about the perverse consequences of what we describe as defence bipartisanship. So the Australian political class is really, really proud of its bipartisan approach to a few key areas. The defence is the really first and foremost one, which makes it seem like everybody's getting along and there's no politics getting involved. There's no special interests getting involved. But in fact, and in practice, what this means is that our defence posture, our approach to the ADF gets very limited scrutiny, because while political disputes are uncomfortable or can be ugly or can even be obscene and offensive, they actually provide a really strong function of scrutinising the behaviour of the government, or scrutinising even just at the level of ideas. And it does strike me that if what Hastie's talking about, and I think quite rightly, that there hasn't been enough scrutiny, it's because there has been too much bipartisanship. There hasn't been enough. There are too many times where the opposition says we are in lockstep with the government on either side of politics in an area as important as defence.
Well, also because his point is, in the absence of a parliamentary committee, there aren't the opportunities to have in-camera discussions with defence leaders. Obviously, if you're in government, you can. And you can provide briefings to opposition leaders, but there's no equivalent of, say, the intelligence committee that Hastie has been able to work with ALP and other leaders on, that gives you that continuity. And just to
but I think fundamentally it's not an institutional thing, right, Scott? It's about you can set up as many committees as you want.
Well, but it would be a good start, though.
It would be a good start.
I mean, a specific institutional reform is something that is on the table.
Yeah, but my point is that this is a part of political culture as well, and it is a bad part of political culture, that we actually need not just the forums to contest defence policy, but you want to make it contestable.
Okay, but here's the challenge. This is Greg Sheridan's challenge, Chris. You can make it possible, but what's the incentive for politicians? Greg Sheridan's point is always that no one who wants a parliamentary career, no one who wants to climb to the top of the greasy pole does it through defence in Australia. They've never had the interest there. I mean, look at the succession of defence ministers we've had over the past 20 years in Australia. People who just couldn't wait to get out of the place.
Yeah. It's too often a retirement posting.
Yeah, I mean, was it Brendan Nelson who was the last one perhaps to actually seem to enjoy it? No, it's a serious point. I mean, when I remember I read Malcolm Fraser's, Philip Ayres did a great biography of Malcolm Fraser, and they really, really thought about when he was given one of the defence posts. I think it was... it
was Army and Navy.
Yeah, Army and Navy. Because he was the first one not to have fought in the war. Like the idea that a services minister hadn't actually fought in a war was like shocking, and now it's completely the opposite. And I just wonder, the times that we live in, I think that's a luxury we can't afford. We can't afford not to take it seriously.
No, I mean, the way... So it's a delicate thing because you want to be able to debate the policy decisions that the department makes and that the ADF makes. And the Department of Defence, one reason why it's not a necessarily attractive job for a minister is that the Department of Defence is huge, it's unwieldy, it doesn't have just a secretary, it also has the Chief of the Defence Force who are co-equal leaders of the department. It's called the diarchy internally. Or it was when I worked there. And so there's this huge unwieldy bureaucracy, and it's two different bureaucracies that are merged. It's the civilian bureaucracy and then the huge military bureaucracy as well. So it's not a necessarily attractive job, but you want to be able to debate the decisions of the minister and the decisions that are recommended, or the things that are recommended to him by the department, by the Defence Force, without calling into question the institution of the Australian Defence Force itself, because politicising the military is a bad thing for a country. That, like, if the military itself becomes politicised, suppose its very existence were put on the table. We had some sort of peacenik party.
Defund the military.
Defund the military. Then it would have institutional incentive to fight for its own survival and be partisan in that sense. And that's not a good thing because the military is the ultimate repository of violence in the state. So
ideally, you don't want it on one team.
Yeah, so ideally it stays out of this fray. Now, it can't in a way because it's married to the civilian bureaucracy and it's constantly generating policy ideas for how to spend billions of dollars, how to commit treasure and blood to strategic objectives, and these strategic objectives need to be debated because if nothing could ever prove that there needs to be a stronger debate about our strategic objectives, Afghanistan, if anything could ever do it, it'd be Afghanistan that would prove that point. What is the strategic objective would be a starting point. So I would say that it's a little bit more. I don't think that it's necessarily a question of more partisanship around this because you are skirting around something that's very delicate in the basic constitution of any state, which is whether you can trust the people who are trained in arms to support the civil peace rather than their own interests. And you don't want those interests to be put up for debate, I think.
I don't think we disagree, actually, Andrew, because the defence, I think we need to be able to debate the defence posture and we need to be able to debate the institutions that control these sorts of things. I don't think I'm arguing for, debating the existence of the ADF or something like that, which I take your point, but I just don't think is a really substantial risk right now. The other thing, though, and the way I come to this is I haven't done a lot of defence stuff, so I'm going to defer to you, but I've done a lot of national security stuff. And bipartisanship in national security policy, so the sorts of policies, laws and regulations we introduce under the banner of national security, data retention policies, the anti-encryption stuff, bipartisanship there is disastrous. There have been so many moments in the history of national security policy just in the last decade that the failure of particularly the Labor Party to stand up against policies they knew are terrible because they're too scared to politicise has been, it just ended up with really atrocious public policy.
Yeah, on the other hand, with the Defence Force, there is this underlying thing with the Defence Force that it is a lightning rod, or it can become a lightning rod for a broader culture war discussion. And the Defence Force itself is very sensitive about that. And this comes through in different ways. One is this idea of whether there's a connection between a warrior culture and what now gets called toxic masculinity, whether the Defence Force represents some kind of archaic presence in our society, and that's why it needs to be reformed. There's the issue of internal diversity within the Defence Force, which is overwhelmingly white and male, even though for a long time now, recruiters for the three services have had targets for changing that. So there's these kind of underlying culture war issue that risks making the ADF into a political football in a way that, say, a decision about whether we should have bought, the ships that we bought and things like that.
Can I just backfill that a little bit before we go on? Because it's a fascinating thing to talk about the possibility of things being caught up in culture wars, because culture is a term of art for sociologists. And all of this started, and this is one of the things that gives us, that should give Australians faith in the institution, and that the reputation of the ADF will survive this, because it's been very much an ADF-led process. And it started with sociologists employed by the ADF, Samantha Krumpfertz, I think it is, apologies if I butchered her surname, who was asked to investigate the culture of special forces. Apparently it was after Martin Place, and people being asked, well, should we have sent special forces into domestic terrorist incidents? So she was asked to go and look at the culture of the special forces and were they suitable for domestic deployment. I think we answered that question along the way, but it was in that context when she started talking to people that she was collecting these stories and very important stories, and people felt able to confide in her. There had also been various media reports on individual incidents, and that's what got this ball rolling. And this, I think, the Brereton Inquiry has been a 4-year-long process. But I think there's something innately interesting that it's automatically going to be framed as a question of culture by a sociologist. There may be other lenses that you can actually look at all this through, whether it be like, why were there like repeated deployments, why was the army not bearing more of the load, and so on and so forth. But straight away we've zoomed in on that phrase, warrior culture. And I just think, I would have thought special forces need a warrior culture, but I think what's implicit in what Angus Campbell, the head of the Defence Force, was saying was not this kind of warrior culture.
I think that was the distinction that Andrew Hastie was trying to draw too, that there's a positive way of uniting a team of men to achieve a strategic objective in a really dangerous situation, and then there's a way of inculcating in them a sort of a kind of arrogance or God complex, and that you have to... and in the military traditionally that is considered a function of leadership. That it's upon the officers and the chain of command to make sure that that value alignment is there. And so there'll be some debate about whether that's what's broken down here, that some people, because it was sort of notable in the reporting that this negative or toxic warrior culture was attributed to some of the non-commissioned officers as the leaders of generating this feeling, which I think is that could be hand-washing from the people who are supposed to be overseeing them, or it could be a serious thing. That's hard to know from outside. But I think there's definitely a need for a culture that does not step away from the essential capability requirement of an elite fighting force. And that's one of the things that it shouldn't be erased from this, that the SAS and the Army generally exists for a specific purpose, and it has to be able to achieve that. There are ways that we want them to achieve it, but we shouldn't lose sight of the goal. What's a positive warrior culture? It's something that actually allows them to represent Australia, its interests, and defend them.
So again, this is the risk that has been identified. It's a non-zero risk that this could be take us down a slippery slope to somewhere where, because the word culture is being bandied about in the ADF, just as we've seen in so many other walks of Australian life, there will be this impetus, this almost unstoppable push to completely pull that culture apart. So that is the fear that's been identified. We have to hope that's not the case, and the trust that we have in the ADF to contain this, I guess, and the justice system to let justice be done without having to destroy the entire apparatus. But it's a fear. I don't want to say it's well founded, But it would be of deep concern to me too if that's where all this leads.
Early on in this process, they took off the table disbanding the regiment, which is, I think, is what they did in Canada when they had a war crime scandal. They ended up disbanding and then I think perhaps reforming their equivalent of the SAS. But that was taken off the table. It was like, no, we're going to keep this institution. Now there's a unit within the regiment that has been disbanded and its honours have been stripped, but the regiment itself remains. And that seems to me that they're committed to an idea of reform rather than a radical overhaul. But still, there would be a concern, I think, that I would say culture change is an interesting idea just generally in an abstract sense, because it's almost a kind of rationalism, the idea that you can identify certain goals and then top down manipulate people's minds so that they're aligned to these goals that you've chosen from an external process.
And it's deeply unsatisfying in that sense, in that A, it is absolutely true that culture can be determinative for these sorts of things, but B, it's really hard to come up with a set of prescriptions to change a underlying culture.
I think that's right about culture, Chris. And when, interestingly, again, Hastie is worth reading and listening to on this, because his view, which I suspect is very much the official view, the view that the government and the ADF want to have, is to the extent that cultural change was necessary, it's already happened. You know, this 4-year-long Brereton Inquiry, which, you know, is obviously still a long way to go. When challenged, it's like, well, we've already eliminated those toxic elements from the culture within the special forces, so it's already done. And in that sense, it maps to a classic crisis management model that governments adopt, which is you string something out for long enough so that by the time the bad news comes, you can actually say, well, here's some terrible news, here's some real issues of concern, but by the way, they're already fixed. And we see this again and again. Now, that's not to say it's not truthful. I'm just saying it is obviously part of a way of communicating to the public that they can maintain their trust and believe that these issues have already been dealt with.
But you or we as listeners to those statements need more assurance than just a claim that a culture has been changed in that sense. And I'm not sure what public policy changes would address the issues that have been found, but you can't. It is not on us just to hear and assume that that's all been sorted out.
Oh, well, they've actually got an institutional reform for that too. They've set up a panel, an external panel. I have buried in my documentation somewhere that former Inspector General of the forces, along with Rufus Black, ethicist, and Vice-Chancellor of University of Tasmania, and a couple of others have been invited onto a panel which apparently is going to provide the government with quarterly reports on the process of change, which itself is a fascinating process.
That is interesting. I do want to pick up, and we should move on to Adelaide soon, but I do want to pick up something that I think is really interesting that has come out of this, and it's a bit tangential, but what Andrew, you mentioned the possibility that they did it in Canada of disbanding the regiment, or disbanding units, which of course is a symbolic act. It's a statement about the way that we understand our own history, or the ADF sees its own history. There's an interesting claim being made by the Australian War Memorial. I'm just going to quote a news article. The Australian War Memorial will acknowledge the Brereton Inquiry into alleged war crimes by special forces, with its curators being given free rein to address the dark chapter truthfully. Memorial Director Matt Anderson said that the institution is a place of truth, and while the overwhelming majority of Australians who've served in Afghanistan did so honourably, visitors to the memorial would expect the darker parts of Australia's history to be acknowledged. Now, to my mind, this seems really quite wildly early, given that we haven't seen, obviously, legal cases. But nonetheless, how do we as a society, and the War Memorial is for civilians as much as it is for the Defence Force, civilians to understand the Defence Force that keeps us safe and free. How are we supposed to understand or reckon with negative acts that the Defence Force may have taken on our behalf?
This is an example of how a debate about defence policy, about its oversight, whether there should be greater partisan contestation over it, can tip over into a kind of culture war flagellation of the institution itself. There's no reason whatsoever for museum curators to dedicate themselves to deconstructing Australia's military history, recent or otherwise. The War Memorial, its purpose is captured in its name. It is there to memorialise, to commemorate the people who have made huge sacrifices for this country. And anything that detracts from that context, I think, is inappropriate. Now, that's not to say whitewash this history, that it should never appear in a museum anywhere, it should never appear in a history book. Of course it should. But if it's not, if the purpose is to detract from what the Australian Defence Force really represents for this country, and knowing the way some of our other institutions have been used by partisans to essentially mount attacks on the traditional Australian culture, I think we should be suspicious. The idea that the Australian War Memorial would come to play a role in national life akin to the ABC of being a permanently radicalised intelligentsia full of subversives is extremely angering, I would say. It's infuriating, the prospect of it. So I think that they should, as best as possible, steer clear from detracting from the mission of memorialising something as serious as the military.
I think that's a
very well said, Andrew.
Point.
Very well said,
Andrew. I just want to clarify: is that an argument against it in the War Memorial because the War Memorial is to commemorate, has a specific function to commemorate the deeds of people who have sacrificed extraordinarily for this country and for their fellow citizens? Or is that a more general claim about the role of museums and the role of how we see our history?
I think the War Memorial is an interesting museum because it's both a memorial and a museum. So, when you go there, I mean, this is actually the physical reality of it. That there's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and there's the memorial part, and then you go deeper into it, and they have the museum with the military equipment,
which makes it very different to say something like the Imperial War Museum in London, which is purely there as a museum of war.
Yeah, and it makes it different from, say, the Shrine of Remembrance, which isn't there is now a kind of annex on it. But you take my point.
Yes.
So it is a kind of an unusual beast in that sense, but it's the story that it exists to tell is the story of Australians in war and why they've gone there and why this is important for our country to remember. And I think that now there might be a way to do this in a way that doesn't detract from that, but certainly, superficially, first blush, it sounds like that this is an excuse to use an important national institution to bash another important national institution. And frankly, this country has enough of that, in my view. This country has enough of institutionalised self-flagellation. In fact, our country should be prouder of what it is. This is a great country, a great democracy. It has provided an astonishing way of life for millions of people from all over the world, and we should be prouder of that fact. And the idea of an institutionalised radical class using something as important as the War Memorial for essentially nefarious ends to undermine that great story of Australia, it raises my hackles, to put it lightly.
No, and there's form. So I can't better what Andrew said about the importance of the Australian War Memorial, but to to take something that was purely a museum, look at the Museum of Australia. When we built the new Museum of Australia, there was obviously an opportunity to relaunch that as a national cultural institution, and it was launched like a living embodiment of the black armband view of Australian history. And I cannot think of a national institution which is less woven into Australian life than the Museum of Australia. Have you ever had any one of your friends say, you must go to Canberra and see the Museum of Australia exhibit on the genocide of the Indigenous peoples?
To be honest, Scott, I'm glad you said it was Canberra, because I don't think I know what the Museum of Australia is.
Yeah, exactly. So,
whereas people do say, when you're in Canberra, the one thing that you must do is to go to the Australian War Memorial. That's the regard that it's held in.
Absolutely. So that's what's at stake. So I can only hope that the director of the Australian War Memorial was loose in his language and was indicating that, yes, at some point we will find a way of integrating this into our stories. I hope that he was verbaled, and certainly the Prime Minister was quick to say, well, this will be done as part of a process and there'll be oversight from the board. But I think we're entitled to feel concerned. And the thing is,
I mean, without wanting to overreact to one set of comments, I just think that, as Scott just said, because of the way this kind of deconstructionist attitude appears in our institutions, I think it's worth reacting quite strongly when there's a hint of it, and just to say, well, in this context, for this purpose, at this institution, we really need to speak strongly against that attitude. So, yes, this is one person's comments once, but it is worth getting on record straight away that this is not what this particular museum is about.
Indeed. Thank you, Andrew. Chris, I think that is as much as we can usefully say about this at the moment. There'll certainly be a lot more to say in future. A bit of a departure for looking forward, but a very, very important issue. Now, but to return to last week's issue, which was South Australia.
And the free state of South Australia now. So, of course, we last week spent a lot of time talking about the lockdown that had just been announced in South Australia. In fact, we had Dan Wild from the IPA on the podcast. We had all great plans to talk about different things. And then while I was on the phone with him talking before the show, they announced lockdown. So we spent a lot of time on that. Turns out that was a 3-day lockdown. It was originally planned for 6 days. It was substantially cancelled after 3 when authorities discovered that a individual had lied to contact tracers. Instead of getting a pizza at a pizza shop and contracting COVID somehow through the pizza box, he'd actually worked 3 shifts in the pizza shop, and that was more than enough to calm the contact tracers in Adelaide, to calm the public health authorities, and dramatically reverse course on what was to be, and was for 3 days, probably the toughest, or one of the toughest lockdowns in the world. Now, this is worth discussing, not just because we spent so much time commiserating Dan about his newfound loss of freedom, and we should probably follow that up, but also it just strikes me as an incredible microcosm of the madness that has been COVID policy throughout 2020. One thing I think we should always remember of this year is the assertion made by the South Australian government that there was a new strain of COVID,
yes,
a particularly virulent strain of COVID that was reproducing at rates hitherto unseen on the planet, that had been detected, as we now know, from one interaction in a pizza store. And that required this massive, extraordinary shutdown. Andrew, What's your take?
Chris, I mean, you're sounding alarmingly like a public health skeptic. I mean, you don't sound like someone who trusts the science at all.
Anti-vaxxer.
No, I think that's right. It's the abiding question from what happened in South Australia is this what we're going to do every time?
Forever.
That's exactly. That's the question. It's They hit upon what they thought was a mystery. They shut down the state. They threw everyone's lives into chaos. And then it turned out it wasn't that much of a mystery after all. It was just one guy hanging out with another sick guy for 3 days or something. And it turned out that they only had to trace, the people who'd worked at the place and not every single customer the shop had ever had. And so that's, when I read about this, that was the question I had was, is this going to be my life? Like the rest of my life, every time someone turns up sick, suddenly the economy is shut, and it can't be that way. And if it is the case that when they think they've detected an outbreak of this, that they need to have such strong measures, then we're going to need to formalise in law with considerable public debate and oversight. What are the triggers for this? It can't just be the case that some anonymous white coat somewhere says this is a mysterious new strain, therefore the economy is done. That can't continue to be the reality. There has to be, at the very least, some sort of formal process that the rest of us get to engage in and debate about, so that when this does happen, we don't feel like the rug has been ripped out from under us.
The ability to ask questions. I mean, it's as we've discussed on this podcast so often, when somebody says the science is settled, that should be like a red flag straight away, because science is a method, not an outcome. Science is not a peer-reviewed paper. It's certainly not the opinion that's given to a political leader by a chief health officer. And in terms of science being a method in the tradition of Karl Popper, the idea that you're looking at a bunch of facts, and the only hypothesis you can come up with, Chris, is that in Adelaide, of all places in the world, there is this amazing new strain of coronavirus that is has mutated and spreads incredibly rapidly. Am I going to wait for genetic testing because we've sequenced the genome? Are we going to await genetic testing? No, I'm going to tell Stephen Marshall, mate, this is the only explanation I can come up with. You better shut the entire state down right now.
And you can't help but think that this is a microcosm of everything that's happened, because not only the South Australian government has gotten furious with this. I think individual student, I think it's a foreign student who was working both at the pizza shop and the hotel, absolutely furious and blaming this person for lying to contact tracers, which of course I do not endorse. And I do not think that you should lie to contact tracers, and it is really counterproductive, and we people should be grumpy with them. But it was the decision of the government to shut down. It is not the decision of individuals who get the coronavirus. And coming from Melbourne, as we've experienced day in, day out for 15 weeks of being told a list of people who did the wrong thing, being blamed for public policy decisions that were made or failed to be made. It rankles. And you know what? It's that law and order approach to COVID that the Victorian government has taken. And I do feel quite sorry for this kid who apparently has been, is lawyered up. They're searching for things to charge him with. It's very unclear what one charges someone with. It's just an extraordinary microcosm, I think.
The penalty is going to be ostracisation, because he's going to be deported probably. And this is now, he did the wrong thing, yes, but he is also a very convenient scapegoat for a process that is clearly broken. But for this guy's lie, we would have done exactly the right scientific thing.
The Premier says, if it hadn't been for this guy, I would be not looking like quite such a dickhead as I am right at the moment.
Exactly.
Therefore, he must pay the price.
And it's just that it can't continue this way. It can't be that we leap at shadows. It can't be that the first narrative out the door is the one that wins, and the first narrative out the door is always the most hysterical one. It's going to have to be a little bit more sober, and the involvement, Chris, as you say, of turning it into a police issue, into a criminal matter, is part of the ramping up of the seriousness of it, the hysteria around it. And that's simply unsustainable. I mean, the criminal law policing that exists for... The thing that distinguishes the criminal law from other forms of law is seriousness. That's it. There's no analytic distinction. It's just these are the single most serious things that we have in our society.
What we've decided is not just a crime, but a crime against society.
Yeah, it's not just a wrong. It's not just a wrong that you've done to someone. It's a wrong you've done to society itself. And we do this in our society a lot in Australia, is we actually... we basically pretend that civil wrongs are crimes. We attach criminal penalties to all kinds of things that don't affect anyone but the parties involved. A lot of things like land clearing laws or legal dumping, and like environmental law is a good example of this. So there's a lot of criminal penalties that never get used, but actually are on the books and they're attached to these things. And this is in danger of becoming another one of these things where we turn it into something that's as morally serious as murder and assault and all these things that we call crimes, rather than thinking about it, dare I say, scientifically, as a medical thing that needs to be managed in an ongoing, sustainable way. I mean, if I sound like a wishy-washy moderate on this, it's only because the issue itself is one that deserves a moderate response.
In a time of extremism, it is the wishy-washy moderates that are the true
and I mean, I don't think I wouldn't normally be accused of moderation.
Or being wishy-washy, no.
But on this, I mean...
Yep.
Surely this is a matter of just sensible,
deliberate decision-making. We can only
sensible
hope.
Centre. Andrew Bushnell, sensible centrist.
Yeah. Yep, there you go.
For this time only, this issue specifically, I'm tacking to the sensible centre.
Very good. Yes. No, thank you, Andrew. And anything more we hear from South Australia, we'll let you know. We have come to that part of the show, our Books and Culture segment, where the panellists share what they've been reading, watching and listening to. Chris, what have you been watching?
So, no, I've been reading,
a book.
Scott. How dare you? I have been reading a book that I have intended to read for a very long time. I should say I'm not actually reading it. I'm listening to it as an audiobook, which makes it even more horrifying. It is a book that was published a better part of 20 years ago, 1998, I think, called Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898. It's written by Edwin Burrows and Mike Wallace. It is an extraordinary and extraordinarily large history of that period in New York, of course, before it was even New Amsterdam, all the way to 1898. An extraordinary achievement. When I first visited New York, I think in 2000, I bought this book. It's about 3,000 pages. It sits on my shelf, humiliating me into reading it. But now I've committed for the next at least month to listening to it. It is fantastically well written, absolutely fascinating. I'm really taken by the history of Dutch New York. So, of course, when it was called New Amsterdam, the legacy that Dutch New York had on later British New York, as well, of course, its very complex integration into the history of the Revolution and, of course, into the history of the Civil War as not just a trading port, but a trading port for, of course, slaves and a funder of much of the industry of the 19th century United States. So an amazing achievement and a horrifyingly large achievement at that.
What did you learn from it? How did it change your view of New York?
How did it change my view of New York?
I'm thinking of Gangs of New York here with Daniel Day-Lewis for some reason.
And I'm going to watch Gangs of New York again. I'm not quite up to that. I'm still only in the 18th century.
Yes.
No, I think the thing that has really struck me is sometimes you just know, oh yeah, it used to be called New Amsterdam. Well, it was a Dutch colony, and it's shaped by the fact that it was a Dutch colony taken over by the English. But
and some of those old families still are still rich.
But the mercantile nature of New York,
the Matthew effect,
that was from day one because it was the Dutch. And the Free Dutch at that. I may have made this argument on the podcast before, but I think we understate the role of the Dutch Republic in the history of human liberty, and this was a outpost of the Dutch Republic.
Yeah, good one. Can't promise I'll read it. 3,000 pages might be too much.
You almost certainly won't, but it's still a cracker of a book, and I have to talk about it.
Okay, now Andrew has a book, so I might go next to break it up a little bit. So last night on Foxtel, I watched Hillbilly Elegy. Attentive listeners will know that we have spoken about the J.D. Vance book, Hillbilly Elegy, published in 2016, that this movie is based on, the story of a young man who grew up in Ohio, but his family was originally from Kentucky, real hill country. In the book, as in the movie, there's some distant connection to the feud of the Hatfields and the McCoys, and it was a book that became, which I read, and it's a great book. And for anyone I think that's come from, small towns and tried to find their way in the big city, that's a story that's always relevant. But it made such a splash too because with the election of Trump, it was like, who are all these people? Who are all these white poor people who suddenly want to vote for this guy, Trump? And in the searching for explanations, this book became very influential because he talked about that culture, the hillbilly culture, its good things, its bad things, generational family breakdown, the contrast between the positive experience so many of them had had when they moved into the Midwest to work in factories, had good jobs in good factories like the heyday of American manufacturing, contrasted with the Rust Belt that it became and the social dysfunction. So all of that is in the great book by J.D. Vance, who is himself a Republican, and I think we'll hear a lot more of him. This movie is nothing like that. This movie fastens very much. It's directed by Ron Howard. It fastens on the relationship of this guy with his mother and her the collapse of her life, drug use and so on. He was essentially raised by his grandmother. In the movie, the grandmother is played by Glenn Close, who is pretty awesome. The mother is played by Amy Adams, and I'm sorry, but nothing she did ever stopped me thinking this is Amy Adams trying to look like a drug-addicted woman from Ohio, and just nothing about it was believable. So it's inspired by a book by J.D. Vance saying where he came from and what it represented. He's almost a spectator to the whole thing. He's there as a young man, and then later, by the time he's made it out of that environment into Yale, he's feeling the pull back to where he grew up and the dysfunction, and it's almost like the tension is meant to be, can he go forward with his life or will he be sucked back into this vortex of social dysfunction? But it's not believable because you know how it finished. And he's really dull. He's just like, you're not interested in him. So it's a bit of a mess of a movie.
It's a really interesting thing to have come out right now because, of course, the book predates the 2016 election. It just was released at a really, really convenient time as purported explanation. And now, of course, we've got it at the back. But I've always thought it was a wildly overwrought, and it was part of that post-2016, oh my God, what actually happened here? We've got to look at the poorest of all white communities in the United States as the answer for why Donald Trump won. As you were talking, I was just Googling, even in California, Donald Trump won more than, in fact, just under 6 million votes. Now, of course, there are rural communities in California, but the idea that it had to be the Hillbilly Elegy, it had to be these very small, specific communities.
Oh, and
suddenly became,
and the Washington Post and the New York Times suddenly said to their reporters, "Oh, go down there and find out what's going on."
Go find the smallest town you can, interview 2 people, and then we'll finally understand.
For about a year there, they basically hired foreign correspondents to send them to the interior of their own country, and then they quickly lost interest in it and decided that it'd be full-time campaigning against Trump, and so that they don't. Who cares about their voters? But I think about Trump's voters, but I think. The actual story, and so I would probably depart from Chris on this a little bit about the significance of it, is the symbolism of J.D. Vance's story is more in actually the contrast with the book that you were talking about, Chris. It's this contrast between New York and America's other great cosmopolitan ports and the connection of those to the old world and now to the world at large.
Globalization.
And then its interior, it's what might be called its sort of folk tradition from the interior, fighting to be represented as those cosmopolitan cities become more powerful. And so I think the story, the details of his own life may not be all that representative, but the contrast between that story and the story of New York is part of it. And also the fact that J.D. Vance himself is a guy who straddled both worlds. He moved from one to the other through this new system of patronage that has developed. You only have a couple of paths to the other side of this, and he went through the military, and then he was he used the GI Bill, which pays for university. He went to an elite university, and he emerged as this think tanker and now Wall Street banker, right? So he kind of straddles both these worlds, and I think it's in the contrast that you find something interesting that's happened in the last, since 2016 and now through what looks like at least a temporary pause in the Trump era.
Yeah, it could have been a much more
temporary pause.
It could have been a much more interesting movie. Oh, and by the way,
are we already betting on 2024, Andrew? Is that?
And at the risk of stretching this out too long, I mean, also, as someone who has a vast interest in that Appalachian culture, in the music, in the history of that land, it doesn't get any of it. Ron Howard doesn't have a clue. There's 5 minutes set in the actual Kentucky region, which was a silly little story that doesn't really speak to anything. So you're told that you're really dealing with this sort of ethnic culture, based on the historic Scots-Irish culture that took root there, hundreds of years ago. None of that, even in a thumbnail, is elucidated. Other than that, it's about family, and they fight a lot, and they yell at each other, and then it's social dysfunction. It's just, damn it, could have been good, but isn't. What have you got, Andrew?
I uncommonly, for when I appear on the show, I read a book, but don't worry, it's not a serious book. It's
is it a book about Netflix?
It's a novel written by Norm Macdonald, who's a comedian. Many years ago, he was on Saturday Night Live. He was famous for doing a pitch black, very dry fake news segment. Saturday Night Live has their fake news segment, Weekend Update it's called, and Norm hosted this for three years. In the 90s, he's famous mostly for being extremely funny to a small set of people, including all other comedians in the world. So all the other comedians will say he's the funniest one. And his book, it's clear that they commissioned him to write a memoir, and they wanted him to come back with stories about back scenes at SNL and all this stuff. And he's turned in this fake memoir that's a novel that starts with a completely made up childhood in rural Alberta, and you can go to his Wikipedia page and find out that he grew up in Quebec City. It starts from there, and it just gets more and more absurd. And if you remember Norm even vaguely, or if you're interested in someone who's extremely funny and has a unique sense of humour, then this book is really good. There are parts of it that are very well written. Probably it could have required a little bit more discipline, but some of it is actually extremely well written. It's very funny. And I mean, I've basically got my YouTube algorithm now is trained perfectly. It only shows me Tucker Carlson videos and Norm Macdonald videos. And so reading this book for me was a great break from some of the other more serious reading that I have to do. Good. What's something funny he did? What's something funny that he did? So he's most famous, I would say, for essentially getting fired from Saturday Night Live for making repeated jokes about O.J. Simpson being a murderer. And it turned out that one of the executives at NBC, who was a personal friend of O.J., warned him off, and it didn't stop him, and he just doubled down, and eventually they just gave him the hook.
Okay, that's good enough for me. What a hero. Good on him.
Yeah, what a hero.
So thank you. You've been listening to Looking Forward. Remember, this is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au and see how you can join or donate to support this and other digital productions of the IPA and get all those wonderful benefits of membership. Big thank you to my co-host, Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott.
Special guest today, Andrew Bushnell.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks to Mitch in the control room. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.